What's going on, everybody? Josh Engleman for Awesemo.com, and I am back with my top 5 FanDuel plays for this Sunday's NFL main slate. My favorites. My top 5 at quarterback, at running back, at wide receiver, and at tight end. So be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all of our other content goes live. Follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman so you can get updates to my sim results as we get closer to lock. And finally, let me know in the comment section, who are your favorite options? QB, running back, wideout, and tight end. We're going to start at the tight end spot, rounding out the bottom of my top 10, Robert Tonyan, Hayden Hurst, Kyle Rudolph, Jordan Akins, and TJ Hawkinson, who's on the outside looking in. Who will be the top 5 tight end plays? It's time to find out. Now, there's not a huge amount of separation coming from Hunter Henry to TJ Hawkinson, but it is enough to put Henry in the number 5 spot. Had to make sure for a second. I thought just for a split second that I forgot to unmute my microphone. Hunter Henry, number 5, 6K, 8.4 fantasy point projection. It's a really nice spot against the Patriots defense that has been abysmal, whether it's against the run, they're 28th, or against the pass, where they're 30th. You're not expecting a monster day out of Henry, but he should be efficient for the salary. Shows up in the optimal lineup 6% of the time. That's enough to get you to number 5. Coming in at number 4, we've got Dallas Goedert, 6,200. Philly in a good spot at Green Bay, or at least a good game script for Dallas Goedert. 9-point underdogs, a 48-point game total, but a nice defensive matchup. Packers 24th against the run, 18th against the pass. You're not expecting a crazy monster day. I don't expect Dallas Goedert going north of 25 fantasy points really at all, but 6.7% chance of being in the optimal lineup. We have a guy or 2 guys at the top that are kind of on a different tier. Dallas Goedert looks fine, but he looks really similar to all the guys around him. Now, this is where we take our first step up in tiers. We're going to Evan Ingram, number 3. He's 6K, 8.3 fantasy point projection at Seattle. Regardless of who the quarterback is for the Giants, this should be a really nice game script. 10-point underdogs, 47-point game total, and the 29th ranked pass defense in Football Outsiders passing DVOA. I love this spot for Evan Ingram. He could even go big. 1% of the time he goes for north of 25 fantasy points. 8.2% of the time he is in the optimal lineup. So you see, we took a bit of probably like a half step north of Dallas Goedert, but there's still 2 more to go. Now we take a lot more than a half step up to number 2, Mike Gesicki, 5,700, 9.1 fantasy point projection. Great matchup against Cincinnati. You'd like a little bit more of a total, but the Dolphins are heavy favorites. And whether it's Tua or Fitzpatrick, I'm assuming it's Tua right now, but I don't think it matters all that much for Gesicki. 26th ranked pass defense in Football Outsiders DVOA. I love this matchup. I love the game. I love the price. Gesicki gets there 12.8% of the time, significantly more than the rest of this tight end list, except for number 1. And at number 1, showing up in 17% of optimal lineups, that would be Darren Waller, 7K, 11.4 fantasy point projection, a 2.5% chance of going for north of 25 fantasy points. He's got a ceiling unlike anybody else on the slate at tight end. Shows up in the optimal 17% of the time. You can see we've really separated from the pack with Waller, and that's what happens when you face the Jets. 9.5-point favorites, a 47-point game total, and the worst pass defense in the league. All signs point to Darren Waller. I've been rostering him a ton. Didn't work last week. It's not stopping me from going back to him again. Now we move on to the wide receivers and rounding out the top 10, Keenan Allen, Devontae Parker, Allen Robinson, Michael Thomas, and DeAndre Hopkins coming in at number 6. For the most part, 5, 4, 3, and 2 are all bunched together. You can separate those guys however you see fit, but we have a clear-cut number 1, which we're about to get to. Now, at number 5, we've got Adam Thielen, 7,800, projected for 14 fantasy points in a dream spot. Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Vikings are 10.5-point favorites, a game total north of 50, 26 against the run, which doesn't matter for Thielen, but it certainly isn't a bad thing to see them stink against the run. 31st against the pass. Thielen goes for north of 25 fantasy points about 12% of the time. That's enough to show up in the optimal lineup 15% of the time. Love Thielen, love the matchup. Everything looks good for Vikings wide receivers. Like I said, everything looks good for Vikings wide receivers. Coming in at number 4, just a hair north of Adam Thielen, it's Justin Jefferson. 7,700. You guys know the drill now. 10.5 point favorites, 50-point game total, crappy defense against the Jags. Goes for north of 25 fantasy points 12.8% of the time. I like Justin Jefferson. I like Adam Thielen. I like rostering them together in a bigger game stack. These guys make up a ton of the passing game. Obviously, we're going to talk about Dalvin Cook in the future. That should be no surprise. I love the double stack. I love single stacking both sides. There's no problem here. Grab your Vikings wideouts. At number 3, we're heading to the Los Angeles Rams, 6,600 for Cooper Kupp, 12.5 fantasy point projection. We know we're getting a high pace game. Cardinals, one of the fastest teams in the league. Rams, slight favorites, 48-point game total. Middle of the pack defensive matchup. All signs point to a nice Cooper Kupp. I've said all signs a lot. I really need to stop doing that. 10% chance of going north of 25 fantasy points. Look, Cooper Kupp is just going to be involved, and I don't think 6,600 is an outlandish price. I think he should probably be priced a little bit higher. I think 7K would be a little bit more realistic, and that's why you see Cooper Kupp coming in at number 3. In a general output, I think that he should be more in like the 7 to 8 range, but he's just too cheap, and that extra couple $100 really matters this week with some high-priced running backs on the slate. Or high-priced wide receivers in $9,500 Davante Adams, 16.7 fantasy point projection. Very tasty matchup against Philly. 9-point favorites, a 48-point game total, and the 20th ranked defense in passing DVOA. This is what you're looking for out of Adams. 22.6% of the time he goes for north of 25. Probably like 15% that he can go north of 30. Those are big, big numbers on FanDuel. We've seen him have those kind of days. I see no reason that Philly is going to slow him down at all. 17.5% of the time he's in the optimal lineup. That's a bit of a step up from that Kupp, Jefferson, Thielen tier, but we're taking another step up to number 1. And at number 1, we've got Brandon Cooks, 6,500, 13.5 fantasy point projection against Indy. Now, the game script looks good. Houston slight underdogs, 51-point game total. A slightly difficult defensive matchup, 9th against the run, 6th against the pass. But the Texans don't have Will Fuller anymore. Fuller gets suspended for being on the gas. Greater than 25 fantasy points for Cooks 13% of the time. Not a monster number. It's not the same thing you see for someone like Davante Adams. But he's in the optimal lineup 21.3% of the time because 6,500 is just too cheap of a price for a guy that's going to have the opportunity that Cooks is getting. He's priced as if he's not the number 1 receiver, and now he is. I love getting to Cooks. He's a no-brainer cash option. He looks a little bit better on DraftKings because of the PPR scoring, but he's still fantastic, and he's still the best wide receiver for this week. To the running backs we go, and we're rounding it out with Myles Gaskin, Chris Carson, Gio Bernard, Miles Sanders, and at number 6, Aaron Jones, which is kind of surprising. Look at the gap between Jones and Sanders. Sanders in the optimal 9% of the time. Jones at 16.5%. So there's a clear top 6, but Jones is on the outside looking into the top 5. Coming in at number 5, someone I roster more than I feel like anybody else in the world, that would be James Robinson, 7,800, a 15.7 fantasy point projection for Robinson against the Vikings. It doesn't really matter about game script for Robinson. They could be running the ball. He's going to be doing it. Is he catching passes out of the backfield? Whether they're winning or losing, he's going to be doing it. 50-plus point game total. A perfectly pedestrian defensive matchup, 16th against the run, 11th against the pass. Robinson goes north of 25 fantasy points, 12.6% of the time. Because of the price, it's enough to put him in the optimal lineup 17.6% of the time. I rostered James Robinson a ton. He's my 5th ranked running back. It's going to happen again this week. Break out the salary for this one. Number 4, 10,500. It's Dalvin Cook, 19.7 fantasy point projection. Monster favorites, incredible matchup on both sides, whether he's running the ball or catching it out of the backfield. A 28% chance of going for north of 25 fantasy points. 18% of the time he's in the optimal lineup at 10,500. Look, he looks fantastic. You're going to have to be very aware of the way that you're building your lineups because Cook and Thielen and Jefferson are all elite options this week. So be concerned with the way that you build it out. Watch the lineup construction show with myself and Alex Baker. We can delve into that a little bit. But while we delve into that, we delve into this. That's the worst joke I've ever made in my entire life. I'm not going to cut it out, but I probably should. Look, just play Dalvin Cook. Even at 10-5, he's worth his salary. He's the 4th ranked running back on FanDuel. He's going to get it done regardless of where this direction the game goes. Whether they're pounding the rock, then Dalvin Cook's getting 30 carries. If the game stays close, then he might only have 20 carries, but he's going to have a lot more targets out of the backfield. I love Cook even at 10-5. But you can also spend $10,000 on my number 3 guy, Derrick Henry, 18.6 fantasy point projection. Slight favorites, so this game script fits Henry pretty well. You know that if they get out in front, he is going to be the workhorse in the second half. 54-point total as well, so you're expecting a lot of scoring. The 20th ranked run defense in Football Outsiders DVOA. 24.5% of the time Derrick Henry goes for north of 25. And you know that he can put up, 15 on a single run? Derrick Henry from his own 10, 90 yards and a touchdown? It's not like we don't see it regularly at this point. 18.1% chance of being in the optimal, 0.1% ahead of Dalvin Cook. Now at number 2, we're taking a big leap up, 7,000 for Austin Eckler, 15.2 fantasy point projection. We're going to the Chargers. It's a great game for the Chargers. We're expecting it to be relatively even. They're 1-point underdogs with a 47-point game total, and the Patriots defense is atrocious. 28th against the run, 30th against the pass. Eckler can be involved in all facets of the game. I don't expect the crazy monster performance. 12% of the time he goes for north of 25. But because of his price tag, that $7K, it makes him incredibly affordable. 22.3% of the time he's in the optimal lineup. You can see that's a big step ahead of Dalvin Cook, ahead of Derrick Henry. You might not need as much out of Eckler, but I think he gets there more frequently. That's why Eckler gets to 2, but he's not number 1. Number 1, 6,200, projected for 14.4 fantasy points. David Montgomery. He's my number 1 on DK as well. I love the game script. Slight favorites, taken on the Lions. 45-point game total's fine. The 23rd ranked rush defense, yuck. The 28th ranked pass defense, yuck. 10% chance of going for north of 25. 23.3% chance of being in the optimal. Guys like Montgomery and Eckler are what allows you to get to one of Henry or Dalvin Cook. Those guys are so expensive that $6,200 David Montgomery looks pretty good at that 14.4 fantasy point projection. He's one of the more efficient guys that you could roster this week. So I'm going to David Montgomery as my number 1 running back. Now, before we get to the quarterbacks, one last reminder, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all of our other content goes live. But the biggie is follow me on Twitter, at Josh Engleman. I post updates to my sim results over the weekend. You don't want to miss it. When we get news, things will change. If that stuff sort of moves around, it affects every position. If there's a trickle-down effect from top to bottom, you don't want to miss it. I'll certainly have an update early in the morning on Sunday, probably one additional one right before lock. So again, Twitter, at Josh Engleman, that's the place to be for my updates. Now at the bottom of my top 10, we've got Phillip Rivers, Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers, Taysom Hill, and my number 6, Justin Herbert. 5 quarterbacks are at the top of the heap. It's time to dive into them. Here's number 5. I assume when I hold up that 5, I'm just kind of like talking into the back of my hand and blocking the microphone, which is not all that helpful. But number 5, Cam Newton, 7,500, 20.3 fantasy point projection. Very even game script. I think the fact that the Chargers are the 31st ranked run defense is pretty appealing to me. I like Cam in those short yardage situations. If they get anywhere inside the 5, I think it might be pretty easy to pick up a 6-point rushing touchdown out of Cam. That would help out a ton. Goes for north of 25 fantasy points 27% of the time. He's the optimal quarterback in 7% of lineups. You guys know the drill at this point. Quarterback exposure is going to be relatively flat. There's not a lot separating individual quarterback performances. It's all about who you pair him with. Maybe you grab Jacoby Myers. Maybe you run Cam Newton naked. Either one of those scenarios, I think, are perfectly fine. And there's certainly run back options on the Chargers side. What up, Keenan Allen? Number 4, you're going to have to pay a pretty penny for him. 9K Russell Wilson, 21.6 fantasy point projection, a date with the Giants, 10-point favorites, a 47-point game total, a not good defense, 15th against the run, 25th against the pass. I think Wilson can get it done either way. He goes for north of 25 fantasy points. Buckle up, 38% of the time. You're going to need that on a 9K salary, but I see no reason not to go there. And you know, between Lockett and Metcalf, you have the pass catchers. to roster with him. 7.2% of the time he's in the optimal. That's good enough for number 4. Number 3, Kirk Cousins. We already know how much we like Cook and Jefferson and Thielen. Cousins, 7,300, a 19.8 fantasy point projection. Arguably the best or second best defensive matchup in the league. Big favorites, big total. You're expecting the scoring. It's all about whether or not Dalvin Cook gets in there on the ground or not, because if he doesn't, the likely scenario is Cousins throwing for a bundle of touchdowns. Goes for north of 25 fantasy points 28% of the time, puts him in the 3 spot. 7.8% of the time it's Cousins in the optimal lineup. Now I know this one's up in the air, but if Tua plays this week, 6,700 is way too cheap. I got him projected for 19.9 fantasy points. 11.5 point favorites against Cincy. The Bengals are bad, real bad defensively too. 26th against the pass. This could be a really nice breakout spot if Tua can get on the field. This is why you follow me on Twitter at Josh Engleman for updates. If Tua is out, we're going to see Ryan Fitzpatrick somewhere in this top 10. But for now, I'm going with the assumption that it's Tua. 28% of the time he goes north of 25 fantasy points. That's enough to put him in the 2 spot, but it's not enough to get him to number 1. Because the number 1 option this week is $8,200 Deshaun Watson, 22 fantasy point projection. A tough spot against Indy. They're a top 10 defense against the run and the pass, but slight underdogs and a 50-plus point game total means we should expect Deshaun Watson to throw the entire time. He goes for north of 25 fantasy points 37% of the time. $800 cheaper than Russell Wilson is incredibly helpful. Clearly, I love the pairing with Brandon Cooks, my number 1 wide receiver option. And in 8.8% of the lineups, Deshaun Watson is in the optimal. I love this spot for him, not necessarily from a defensive standpoint, but because of the pace of this game and the total of this game, I think Watson's going to have a ton of opportunities to rack up fantasy points. Alrighty, folks, that will do it. That is my FanDuel breakdown for Sunday, Week 13's NFL main slate. My top 5, my favorites, the best 5 at every position. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. I don't care about defenses any longer. One last call. Like, subscribe, notification bell, Twitter, at Josh Engleman. You guys know the drill. I will be back next week for another issue. We'll call it an addition. We'll combine those 2 words. I'll be back next Friday for another one of these top 5 videos. Look around. There should be a link for a DraftKings video as well if you're playing on both sites. Good luck this Sunday. I'll see you Sunday morning for the NFL Strategy Show.